first opportunities that I have as chairman of the panel to share with you or share with others some of the findings of the report and some of the ideas for future work. I should add that in addition to being chairman of the panel and to the fact that I was president of Slovenia, I did work for the United Nations for a long time. Both as ambassador of Slovenia to the United Nations and later as Assistant Secretary General of Political Affairs, dealing with projects which have to do with prevention of armed conflicts. So I was quite involved in discussions that have been now developed to very important projects that the World Bank and the United Nations are pursuing together. I think I have pressed the wrong button here on this machine. Somebody should put the right slide on the screen. Okay. So essentially what I would like to tell you in the 10 minutes that I have at my disposal is first to, this one, to advise you to read the report and see the variety of recommendations we are trying to make, and also to try to imagine the dramatic nature of what we are discussing. I could say that the drama of water is one of those silent dramas of our era, which is very real but very little recognized and much less discussed. So there is every reason for the organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations to discuss these problems of water much more directly and with much more ambition. Of course, our angle, the angle of the high-level panel on water and peace, which was initiated by 15 co-convening countries, members of the United Nations, has been to look at the connections between peace as absence of war and water cooperation. We could not avoid the most tragic situations of armed conflicts in which we see increasingly that water is becoming either a weapon of war or most frequently water infrastructure is becoming an object of attack. Both of these practices are violations of international humanitarian law, but both of these practices are spreading. And the awareness of the problem has grown in the past years, largely as a result of armed conflicts in places like Darfur, like Somalia, like Syria more recently. And the Security Council of the United Nations has had the opportunity in November last year to address some of these things in the open discussion that we had. But obviously, we went beyond the questions of existing armed conflicts or situations which already have elements of armed conflict. We looked into the question of water and peace in a more comprehensive way, because peace is not merely an absence of war. It's a situation in which sophisticated cooperation within nation states and internationally are needed. And if I look at the needs that exist in the work of the World Bank for changing behaviors to incentivize collaboration to address childhood stunting, and the kind of work that we have been doing in the panel on water and peace, we can clearly see areas of common concern, areas of common interest, and areas in which our panel, which has produced its report in September, can be of some use to your discussions. You see, we start our report by a chapter which is called The Drama of Water. We want really to put this at the center, to understand that water issues are much more dramatic than people generally believe. But then, of course, the question is, what can be done about it? In which areas progress is most necessary? And we are talking about the situations of peace. We are talking about the situations in which peace has to be strengthened, made more resilient, and any form of sliding into armed conflicts prevented. And by way of example, we can obviously refer to a variety of such areas, three of which are of particular importance. First of them has to do with transboundary water cooperation and inter-sectoral collaboration. I'd like to make just one or two points about transboundary water cooperation, because this is an old and traditional form of cooperation with long history in various parts of the world, in particular in Europe, but also in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America. And we believe that, the panel believes that much further work is needed in this area. I don't know to what extent it relates to this specific project we are discussing this morning, but we should not be neglected either. There are 286 shared water basins in the world, which are involving 140 states, but only 84 among them have joint basin water management bodies. So there is a space for much larger cooperation in that regard. And obviously there are mechanisms that exist, some of which are regionally based and others global. The conventions that have been adopted within the United Nations provide a good platform and a point of departure for that. So transboundary water cooperation should not be neglected. That's one point that I would like to make. On the intersectoral collaboration within states, we see obviously a great deal of competition for water resources among different sectors like agriculture, mining, energy, production, fishing, and other forms of consumption, and of course human consumption. Now this competitive nature of use of water resources should not be neglected either, and the question is what kind of principles should govern cooperation in this area. Our panel believes that this should be done on the basis of an increased transparency. One of the principles is increasing transparency on water cooperation. Secondly, solid scientific basis of understanding of water issues as a point of departure for cooperative projects, and sufficiently develop participatory nature that would involve the stakeholders both from government, business, scientific community, civil society, and other sectors. Now, this may sound a bit abstract, but we have seen in a variety of countries that these issues of transparency, participatory character of cooperation, and of course a solid scientific base of discussion is essential, and that holds true for all regions of the world. So intersectoral cooperation is one area where I believe that your discussion today and your work later would be, I think, not only very important, but would come closer to this whole idea of making water and water cooperation an instrument of peace. The second area is water quality and quantity, and we have heard from Vice President talk about the neglected or underestimated importance of water quality issues. Now the question is, could something be done about this at a global level? If one looks around the world, of course, there are national priorities in that regard, and nation states obviously have their own ways of addressing this issue. Some of them are very successful, many of them are not. And there are regional approaches that are quite developed. Of course, I come from a country which happens to be a member of the European Union, and in the European Union there is a whole legislative process that has to do with water quality issues. And it is continuously important, it is increasingly important, even in fairly developed environment of countries of European Union. But what we really need at the global level is an awareness and up to that progress in terms of developing an international cooperation for ascertaining the water quality, water monitoring and quality at a global level through appropriate mechanisms. There are some mechanisms in place already, we know that, but more needs to be done and more needs to be seen as a priority. So water quantity and quality is something that we have to really put into the picture. Global monitoring as an important priority, sharing of data, use of appropriate technologies, and so forth. And the world hasn't done very much in that regard so far. Much more needs to be done. And finally, a word or two on finance. Obviously, water projects are not known for yielding high profit levels, and therefore financing is somewhat special in this regard and requires a variety of mechanisms. The panel on water and peace that I happen to chair obviously is not a panel of financial experts. We are not pretending that we will be the ones to propose significant innovation in terms of financing of water projects and water infrastructure. But we do see certain things looking from the side. We see a need for several things. First, one of them is the use of the use of conventional financing and the expansion of the ESG principles, environment, social, and governance principles, in a way which would include water issues quite organically. So now how that is to be done, you know better than we, but I can tell you that members of the panel who do not deal with these things professionally have noticed that this is a very important need of our time. Then obviously the other question is, when projects are contemplated, the risk reduction, risk removal is an important question in any preparation of the project. How does one address that? Again, if there is a case for transboundary water cooperation, then there is a need to mobilize countries involved. I'm coming to an end, don't worry. But you know, finance is a fascinating subject, and therefore I have to say a few words about it. And obviously the mechanisms that would encourage and allow appropriate early consultations to identify risks, to make them more manageable, is clearly something that is needed. This doesn't relate to financial resources directly, but it is important as something that affects decision making. And finally, there is also need for applying certain amounts of financial resources, not very large amounts, I have to say, that would be specifically intended to stimulate transboundary water cooperation by such means as preferential and concessional finance to subsidize interest, insurance, and other ancillary costs of large infrastructure projects. Now again, this comes from a group which is not a group of financial experts. But as you can see, some of the needs are clearly visible to the outside world as well. And this is why we are looking towards discussions in the World Bank with great interest. We understand that your focus is on social development, but of course, discussing social development in the World Bank context cannot be without a discussion on financial innovation. I'm very much looking forward to the work of the panel who will speak now, and to your work in general, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.